July 15, 1974. The sun rose over Seattle, warming the lakeside grass where picnic blankets had been spread the day before. The laughter, music, and chatter of families were gone. In their place stood police officers, detectives, and an uneasy silence. Two young women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, had vanished in broad daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses. For the first time, the predator had revealed himself in public. And yet, even with dozens of eyewitnesses, the mystery only deepened. Police began collecting statements from those who had been at Lake Sammamish State Park that Sunday. Nearly every witness told the same story. A polite, well-dressed man with a left arm in a sling approached women, speaking in a soft, friendly tone. He introduced himself as Ted. He asked for help loading a sailboat onto his tan Volkswagen Beetle. A man with a smile too gentle to fear. A man whose charm disarmed suspicion. A man who, somehow, blended into the crowd even as he lured women away from it. Sketch artists worked tirelessly, creating a composite drawing from multiple testimonies. When it was finished, the face staring back from the bulletin boards looked calm, clean-cut, forgettable, almost like the boy next door. The sketch went public within days. Posters covered telephone poles and campus notice boards. Wanted for questioning, man named Ted. Drives a light-colored Volkswagen. The city buzzed with conversation. Who was this mysterious Ted? And why was his name the only clue that connected so many missing women? Detectives from Seattle, Issaquah, and King County formed a joint task force. They created an enormous list of possible suspects. More than 2,000 men who drove Volkswagens or matched the name Ted. Among those names was one that caught an investigator's eye. Theodore Robert Bundy, a law student and campaign volunteer with local political connections. A few people had already mentioned him. And Rule, his former colleague, had called police. So had Elizabeth Klopfer, his girlfriend, who had been quietly wrestling with her suspicions for months. Each woman had described the same unease. The disappearances, the late-night drives, the evasive explanations, the eerie coincidences. But Bundy's charm and background made him an unlikely suspect. Detective Robert Keppel, who would later become one of Bundy's key investigators, recalled. He didn't fit the monster we were looking for. He didn't look like the kind of man who would hurt anyone. And that, of course, was Ted's greatest advantage. By late summer, fear gripped Seattle. Women avoided going out alone. University campuses that once thrived with energy felt tense, guarded. Self-defense classes filled up overnight. Parents called home more often, asking if their daughters were safe. Police press conferences grew more urgent. The media coined phrases like, the Ted murders, and the campus killer. But even as the story dominated headlines, Bundy had already vanished, quietly moving east. He told Elizabeth he'd been accepted into the University of Utah's law school and needed to relocate for a new start. She was relieved, hoping distance might help his strange moods. What she didn't know was that he was already planning to begin again. Not as a student, but as a hunter in a new territory. Salt Lake City, 1974. To neighbors and classmates, Ted Bundy appeared like any other bright law student. He attended lectures, joined study groups, and volunteered with local political campaigns. His professors described him as intelligent but unfocused. He'd often debate the morality of law, how some men could manipulate justice if they were clever enough. Sometimes, when no one was looking, he'd smirk at his own words. Bundy rented a small apartment, decorated sparsely. He kept his tan Volkswagen parked outside.
And this is, I guess, where it counts. To me, that means that we go over things in great detail, but not just the incident itself. Ultimately, whether it's to you or to somebody else, because basically it all began in Washington State. That is, that's where I was living. That's where I grew up as a kid. And that's where I grew up as a young man. And those kinds of images, impulses, and behaviors which ultimately led to the violent behavior, occurred, if you will, in Washington State. That the kind of broad understanding that I'm looking for is going to come, during those years I lived in Washington State. Unfortunately, I guess from your standpoint, it was basically Washington State where those first crimes, incidences, murders that took place. Well, let's just do one here. I mean, let's start. Obviously, we got to start somewhere. And I think we might, it's a long shot, it's a pretty long shot, that you might be able to get something out of it. At least some of that so-called tangible evidence that might be of some value not only to you but to others. And maybe a bit of information, even if you don't find anything else, that might be of some value to families. Okay. So we'll do, I understand that at the Issaquah site, which I could describe to you, would describe to you if you want, there were three remains of three individuals found, two identified and one not, because of the so few, the kinds of remains that were found were so few and unidentifiable. Okay. What do you want? Where this description of the site first? How do you get there? I mean, you just don't make this up, right? Maybe half a mile, quarter mile down this little side road. If you kept on flying all the way down, one of the things that makes it a little bit, well, among the things that makes it difficult is that at this point she was quite lucid, talking about things, about some. It's funny. It's funny, but it's odd the kinds of things people say under those circumstances. And she said that she thought that she had a Spanish test the next day, and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor me for a Spanish test. It's kind of odd thing to say.
Where'd you incinerate it? Come on, partner. These are things I don't know about you.
Yeah, this is probably the disposal method of preference among those who get away with it.
Yeah.
Because, it's the most bizarre thing I've ever been associated with, and I've been associated with bizarre shit.
Right. It's incinerated.
It's incinerated.
Tell me about it. What the hell happened?
Well, don't know the address of the place. I never want to tell this. I promise myself I never tell this because it would. I thought that of all the things I did to this woman, this is probably the one she was least likely to forgive me for. Poor Liz.
Mm-hmm.
In her fireplace. It's really not that humorous, but in the fireplace at that house.
Burned it all up?
Down to the last ash, and then in a fit of twist.
Yeah, that's a slight twist.
Yeah. It's a twist, and it's a lot of work, and certainly very risky circumstances. I mean, the kids come home from school and there's a roaring fire in the fireplace, and it's warm outside.
Did you ever keep anything in your refrigerator?
No.
No body parts in the refrigerator?
No, well, that was not something that I ever found any kind of body part things. Something.
Okay, before you mentioned you gave up the 8 before, and you gave me 3 more. And I don't know what 3 you're talking about. Can you help me a little bit with those?
Washed, polished, unremarkable. Inside he appeared stable, composed. But the same old restlessness returned. The same hunger for control, for danger, for that secret thrill of deception. Back in Washington, the task force kept working tirelessly. Months after the Lake Sammamish disappearances, hikers stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area near Issaquah, not far from the park. The discovery shocked the region. Forensic teams worked around the clock, but identification was slow. The technology of the 1970s limited what could be done. Eventually, they confirmed the worst. The remains were those of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. The press erupted. A faceless monster was no longer just taking women, he was erasing them. For investigators, it was proof that a serial offender was operating. For the public, it was terror turned real. And for Ted Bundy, who read every headline with quiet satisfaction, it was validation. He had outsmarted everyone. Again. Back in Seattle, Elizabeth Klopfer couldn't shake the unease. Though Ted now lived in Utah, she began connecting details. The timing of his absences, the similarity between the police sketch and his face, the Volkswagen in her driveway. Each coincidence scraped at her conscience. One night, she picked up the phone and called the police again. She told them everything, her suspicions, her fear, her guilt for even considering that the man she loved could be capable of such horror. The officer listened, took notes, and thanked her. Then her report joined hundreds of others in a growing stack of leads. Ted Bundy's name was in the file, again, but it would take months before anyone truly followed it. By the end of 1974, Seattle's nightmare had quieted. The disappearances stopped. The papers slowly shifted focus to other stories, but law enforcement knew better. Somewhere out there, the man named Ted was still alive, still thinking, still calculating. And he wasn't done. Because killers like Bundy didn't stop. They evolved. In Utah, Bundy refined his disguise. He attended church services, befriended neighbors, and dated new women. He studied his victims' behaviors with the cold curiosity of a scientist. He was learning how to blend, how to vanish, how to kill without being noticed. The charming student who once answered crisis calls was now perfecting his greatest lie, the illusion of humanity. And while investigators in Washington debated over leads and evidence, Ted Bundy began again, this time hundreds of miles away, under new skies, among new victims. The nightmare had just gone interstate. By the late 1970s, Ted Bundy had become more than a fugitive. He was a national obsession. Every newspaper headline bore his name, every nightly broadcast replayed his smirking mugshot, and every living room in America debated how someone who looked so normal, so handsome, could be capable of such horror. Bundy wasn't just on trial for murder, he was on trial for America's sense of safety itself. When he was finally captured in Florida after his second escape, he was gaunt but composed. He wore his usual calculated smile as the police paraded him into custody. Behind those pale blue eyes burned the same unnerving confidence that had fooled victims and authority figures alike. Ted Bundy didn't just crave freedom, he craved an audience. In 1979, Bundy stood before the court, accused of the brutal attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, where 2 young women had been killed and others severely injured. It was one of the most shocking crimes in Florida's history, and Bundy turned it into theater. Against all advice, he decided to represent himself. No lawyer, no filter, just Ted Bundy versus the system. He relished every moment, pacing the courtroom, objecting to witnesses, cross-examining police officers with the charisma of a television actor. He treated the trial like a debate tournament, often turning to smile at the cameras, occasionally winking at reporters. To many observers, it was both fascinating and horrifying. Here was a man accused of unspeakable crimes, yet behaving like a celebrity guest on live television. He had no remorse, only performance. For the first time in American legal history, a trial was televised from start to finish. Millions tuned in. Bundy, ever aware of optics, used that to his advantage. He smiled. He flirted. He performed. He played the role of a misunderstood man trapped in a legal machine. Women wrote him fan mail. Some came to court dressed up, hoping to catch his gaze. It was a strange cultural moment, a chilling example of charisma overshadowing conscience. While prosecutors laid out blood evidence, eyewitness accounts, and dental impressions that tied Bundy directly to the crime scenes, he continued to act as if he were invincible. He challenged the validity of the evidence, questioned police procedures, and painted himself as a victim of a nationwide witch hunt. But beneath the charm, cracks began to show. As the pressure built, his confidence sometimes faltered. His eyes would dart nervously when confronted with undeniable proof. His voice would tremble slightly when photographs were presented. Still, he fought back with words, his only weapon left. In a bizarre turn, during the cross-examination of a witness, Bundy called his girlfriend, Carolyn Boone, to the stand. There, in front of the cameras and the world, he asked her a question that stunned everyone. "Carol, will you marry me?" She said yes. And under Florida law at the time, a declaration of marriage made in a courtroom before a judge was legally binding. It was Bundy's final performance, a desperate act of control and illusion. To him, it wasn't about love. It was about proving he could still bend reality to his will, even inside a courtroom cage. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. When they returned, silence filled the courtroom. The verdict, guilty. Bundy stood motionless as the judge, Edward Cowart, delivered his final statement, a speech that would go down in history. "It is ordered that you be put to death by a current of electricity until you are dead. Take care of yourself, young man. I say that sincerely. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner." The words cut through the courtroom with tragic irony. The man who could have used his intelligence for good had chosen to destroy. For the first time, Ted Bundy looked hollow, as if the walls around his delusion were finally closing in. Yet even in chains he managed a faint smile. After his conviction, Bundy was sentenced to death, but his story didn't end there. He would face more trials for murders in Colorado and Utah, each one added to the list of atrocities attributed to him. Reporters clamored for interviews. Books were written. Psychologists debated his mind. And Ted, always the manipulator, continued to play the game, confessing, then denying, then confessing again. 4 years he delayed his execution by appealing, stalling, talking, anything to keep the cameras on him. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of being forgotten. As time went on, Bundy began to realize his fame was decaying. The letters stopped. The journalists grew tired. The nation moved on. And for a man who lived off attention, that silence was unbearable. In a final attempt to remain relevant, he began confessing to murders he had long denied, describing scenes, locations, and victims in chilling detail. He hoped the confessions would delay his execution, but they only confirmed what investigators already knew. Ted Bundy's darkness was deeper than anyone had imagined. When his final appeals failed, Bundy's last days were quiet, almost eerie. No more cameras. No more applause. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the ticking of time. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison gates, crowds of people cheered. Some held signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." For many, it was justice at last. But for others, detectives, psychologists, and victims' families, it was a haunting closure. Because Bundy's crimes had not only claimed innocent lives, but also exposed something unsettling about human nature itself. That evil can smile. That danger can look like charm. And that sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide in shadows. They walk among us, smiling, holding doors open, pretending to be kind. Even decades after his death, Ted Bundy's name remains synonymous with deception, control, and psychological horror. His story is studied not to glorify him, but to understand how manipulation, narcissism, and a lack of empathy can destroy everything in their path. He was the face of a new kind of killer, intelligent, articulate, and terrifyingly ordinary. Bundy forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. When the iron gate clanged shut behind him for the final time, Ted Bundy sat in silence. No cameras. No admirers. Just the steady hum of the prison lights. For the first time since his arrest, he was no longer in control of the narrative, and that terrified him. Yet, even in that isolation, Bundy remained a puzzle that America couldn't stop trying to solve. How could a man so intelligent, so educated, and seemingly polite transform into one of history's most remorseless killers? What went wrong? Was he born evil, or did the world make him that way? Psychologists, detectives, and journalists all sought the same answer. What lived inside the mind of Ted Bundy? Bundy's brilliance lay not only in his intellect but in his ability to appear ordinary. He smiled easily, maintained eye contact, and could read emotions like a script. People described him as approachable, friendly, even trustworthy. He volunteered at political campaigns, helped neighbors carry groceries, and studied law. But beneath that surface was a man who viewed relationships not as connections, but as opportunities. To Bundy, every encounter was a performance. Every smile was a tool. Every gesture of kindness had a hidden purpose. He once told a journalist, Society wants to believe that killers are easily identifiable monsters. They're not. They're people like you and me. It was a chilling statement because he was right, and he knew it. Bundy built his life on the illusion of normalcy, constructing layer upon layer of charm until no one could see the emptiness underneath. Psychiatrists who examined Bundy described him as a textbook narcissist. He believed himself superior to others, smarter, better-looking, destined for greatness. Rules to him were for ordinary people. He lived in a world where only his desires mattered. Even when he faced death, Bundy refused to accept responsibility. He crafted excuses, blamed pornography, childhood trauma, or stress, anything that would paint him as a victim of circumstance rather than a conscious predator. But those who studied him saw the truth. Bundy's evil was not madness. It was manipulation born from total lack of empathy. He didn't feel guilt, sorrow, or shame. He only felt frustration when he lost control. One FBI profiler said, "Ted Bundy didn't kill because he was angry. He killed because it made him feel powerful." That thirst for control, emotional, psychological, physical, was his addiction. Bundy's childhood remains a point of debate among biographers. Born Theodore Robert Cowell in Burlington, Vermont, in 1946, he grew up believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. This deception, meant to protect family reputation, planted confusion in his young mind. His grandfather was reportedly volatile and abusive, while Bundy's biological father remains a mystery. Those early secrets, psychologists believe, may have distorted Bundy's understanding of trust and identity. But even as a child, Bundy seemed detached. Neighbors recalled a polite boy who was also strangely cold. He didn't cry. He didn't bond easily. He preferred isolation, observing others quietly, as though studying their behavior like a scientist dissecting an experiment. By adolescence, that detachment had become fascination. He watched people not to connect, but to imitate them. He learned what expressions triggered sympathy, what words earned affection, and how to mirror emotions he never truly felt. He wasn't developing empathy. He was developing a disguise. Bundy once described himself as living with a compartmentalized mind. There was Ted, the law student, the boyfriend, the volunteer, and then there was the other, the one who emerged when no one was watching. This duality fascinated experts like Dr. Al Carlisle, the Utah prison psychologist who interviewed Bundy extensively. Carlisle believed Bundy's crimes were rooted in deep fantasy, vivid mental imagery that grew stronger over years of repression. When Bundy lost control of his carefully built image, those fantasies took over, forming an alternate persona driven by dominance and rage. Bundy never acknowledged this split. He preferred to believe he was always in control, even when describing his crimes to investigators in the third person, saying things like, "The individual would have felt," rather than "I felt." It wasn't dissociation, it was detachment. Bundy refused to let the mask slip, even in confession. Inside prison, Bundy continued to manipulate everyone around him, guards, journalists, even psychologists. He read every article written about himself, often correcting reporters with smug precision. He pretended cooperation while secretly steering interviews to flatter his intelligence. He played chess with words, testing limits, probing for weaknesses. To some guards, he seemed almost likable, polite, witty, well-mannered. But behind closed doors, he mocked them, referring to them as the audience. Bundy's need for attention never faded. When he realized his time was running out, he offered to help investigators solve other cases, if they delayed his execution. He dangled confessions like bait, revealing just enough to stay relevant. It was never remorse, it was leverage. In his final months, Bundy allowed a handful of experts to analyze his psyche. One of them was Dr. James Dobson, who conducted a televised interview the day before Bundy's execution. In it, Bundy blamed violent pornography for conditioning his mind, portraying himself once again as a victim of society. Viewers were divided. Some saw it as a final manipulation. Others saw a man finally facing his demons. But those who knew Bundy best recognized the pattern. Even at the end, he was performing. He wanted the world to look at him, talk about him, and remember his name. To Ted Bundy, fading into obscurity was worse than death. Criminal profilers later categorized Bundy as a psychopath, not a sociopath. The difference, they explained, was that psychopaths are born without the ability to feel empathy. their emotions are shallow, imitated, and used for personal gain. They can mimic humanity perfectly but never truly possess it. Bundy exemplified this definition. He knew the language of empathy but not the experience. He could describe love but never feel it. Psychopaths like Bundy thrive on control, and when they lose it, they spiral. Every trial, every interrogation, every moment of confinement stripped away Bundy's illusion of superiority. And as that illusion crumbled, so did he. Just hours before his execution, Bundy confessed to dozens of murders across several states, some known, others suspected. His tone was calm, detached, almost academic. There was no plea for forgiveness, no apology to the families, only a desire to leave behind one final legacy of fear and fascination. To the end, he never understood the magnitude of what he had done, only the loss of his power. His death was the first moment the world had ever seen Ted Bundy truly powerless. Today, Bundy's case remains a cornerstone of criminal psychology. His life forced law enforcement to rethink how they profile killers, not as monsters hiding in the dark, but as human beings hiding in plain sight. He became a study in manipulation, control, and the fragility of appearances. FBI profilers like John Douglas and Robert Ressler would later use insights from Bundy's case to catch other killers, turning his darkness into a grim lesson that saved lives. Bundy's story endures not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed. That evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it smiles and holds out a helping hand. In every story of darkness, there are those who bring the light. And in the case of Ted Bundy, that light came from women he underestimated. Bundy believed he could outsmart anyone. He thought his smile could erase suspicion, that his words could rewrite truth. But the women he tried to manipulate, the ones who escaped, the ones who testified, the ones who investigated, proved him wrong. They were the reason his mask finally cracked. Among the countless women Bundy deceived, several lived to tell their stories, and it was their bravery that transformed a string of unsolved disappearances into a clear portrait of a predator. One of them was Carol Duranch. It was November 8, 1974, when she walked out of a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, and was approached by a polite, well-dressed man who introduced himself as Officer Roseland. He claimed her car had been broken into and offered to take her to the station to file a report. She noticed the police badge. The voice was calm. Everything about him seemed legitimate, until they turned onto a deserted road. That's when instinct kicked in. She fought back, managing to escape from his car after he tried to handcuff her. Shaken but alive, she ran into the street, flagging down a car for help. Carol Duranch became one of the first living witnesses to Ted Bundy's methods, and her detailed description helped police identify his car, his face, and his strategy. Her courage in testifying against him years later was a turning point in his trial. Her voice, steady but trembling, stood as proof that Bundy could be defeated. In the mid-1970s, local police departments across Washington, Utah, and Colorado were drowning in missing person reports. College campuses whispered about disappearances. Posters lined bulletin boards with smiling faces that would never come home. Most investigators didn't yet realize they were hunting the same man, but a few saw the pattern. Detective Kathleen McChesney, one of the few women in the Seattle Police Department at the time, began connecting the dots. The same type of victims, similar abduction methods, and a mysterious man named Ted driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Her persistence brought together evidence from multiple states and forced departments to share information, something rare at the time. Without McChesney's tenacity, Bundy might have remained a phantom. In Utah, another woman, Detective Cheryl Bishop, played a key role in reanalyzing survivor statements and eyewitness sketches. She pushed her male colleagues to take seriously the accounts that pointed to a clean-cut law student rather than the stereotypical drifter they imagined a killer would be. Their quiet determination built the foundation of the case that would eventually bring him down. In 1977, Bundy was a fugitive. He had escaped custody once and was evading police. During this period, he charmed a journalist named Dr. Al Carlisle, who initially believed Bundy's protests of innocence. But another reporter, Polly Nelson, saw through him. She later became one of his biographers and was among the few who challenged him face to face. Unlike others, she didn't see charisma, she saw contradiction. Nelson's relentless interviews and cross-checking of Bundy's stories exposed his constant manipulation of timelines, details, and motives. Her writing stripped Bundy of mystique, reframing him not as a criminal genius, but as a narcissistic coward hiding behind a mask of intellect. It was a pivotal shift in how the public understood him, and how future killers would be profiled. When Bundy faced trial in Florida, the nation watched, but so did the women he had wronged. Some were survivors, others were families of victims, and some were simply women who refused to let him charm his way out again. They filled the courtroom benches, silent but powerful. Every smile Bundy flashed at the cameras was met with their unflinching stares, reminders of the truth he could never escape. One young law student who attended the trial later said, "He looked at the crowd like we were part of his audience. But when I looked back, I wanted him to know, this was no show. This was justice." In 1980, when Bundy began his appeals from death row, a group of women advocates formed what they called the Task Force for Missing Women. They gathered data, lobbied for victim rights legislation, and supported families still waiting for answers. Their movement helped establish one of the earliest versions of what would later become America's missing persons database, a crucial resource that prevented other killers from hiding between state lines. Ironically, Ted Bundy's crimes inspired the very systems that would make it impossible for his kind to thrive again. But perhaps the most haunting figure in Bundy's story is Elizabeth Klopfer, the woman who unknowingly loved the killer. She met Ted in 1969 through a dating app's predecessor, a newspaper ad and mutual friends, and fell for his charm instantly. 4 years she lived with him, cooked for him, shared her life with him, while women across the region vanished. But deep down something didn't feel right. When she discovered strange items in his apartment, plaster casts, bags of women's clothing, knives, she made an anonymous call to the police. That call became one of the first official tips linking Bundy to the disappearances. Later she would say in interviews, "Part of me didn't want it to be true, but another part of me knew, and I couldn't stay silent." Her decision to come forward, even in fear and heartbreak, became a pivotal moment in the investigation. Every name, every voice, every testimony mattered. The women Bundy tried to silence became the reason he was finally exposed. In the courtroom, their courage shattered his illusion of control. On paper, their words became evidence, and in history, their strength became legacy. Bundy believed he was the smartest man in the room, but it was the women who stood against him, survivors and seekers alike, who proved that intelligence without empathy leads only to destruction. They rewrote his ending. They reclaimed the narrative, and they ensured that Ted Bundy's story would forever be told not just as the tale of a killer, but as the triumph of those who refused to be erased. Ted Bundy is remembered as one of America's most infamous killers, but it's the women whose courage illuminated his darkness who deserve to be remembered more. Their resilience not only exposed one of history's most manipulative predators but also redefined how justice, survival, and solidarity are written in the face of evil. They didn't just stop Ted Bundy. They changed the world's understanding of what it means to survive him. When the final switch was thrown at Florida State Prison on the morning of January 24, 1989, and Ted Bundy's life came to its end, most Americans thought the story was over. But it wasn't. His death closed a chapter, yet opened an entirely new one in the way the United States studied crime, tracked killers, and understood human behavior. Bundy's shadow lingered over the nation, not in fear but in awareness. He had revealed how charm could be weaponized, how systems could fail, and how evil could hide behind the mask of ordinary life. The world would never look at a smiling stranger the same way again. Before Bundy, the concept of a serial killer wasn't part of the public vocabulary. Police departments worked independently, often unaware that similar crimes were occurring across state lines. Bundy exploited that chaos perfectly, moving from Washington to Utah, Colorado, and finally Florida, committing crimes faster than investigators could connect them. But his case forced change. The FBI realized that traditional policing methods couldn't keep up with the emerging pattern of cross-state offenders. So, in 1978, the Bureau formed the Behavioral Science Unit, BSU, at Quantico, led by pioneers like John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and Ann Burgess, who began studying Bundy and others like him to create criminal profiles based on psychological and behavioral evidence. Bundy became one of their most analyzed subjects. Through interviews and reports, the BSU learned how he lured victims, how he rationalized his actions, and how his confidence betrayed him. These insights formed the foundation of what would later evolve into the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, the real-life inspiration behind countless crime dramas and investigative systems worldwide. Bundy's crimes, in their darkness, pushed forensic science and behavioral profiling into the light. Bundy's case became a cornerstone in the science of understanding offenders' minds. Psychologists discovered that serial killers often follow patterns, known as the modus operandi and signature. Bundy's method, targeting college-aged women, using pretexts like injury or authority, and relying on charm, became a textbook example. What fascinated investigators was that his signature wasn't violence itself, but control. He didn't just want to harm. He wanted to dominate, deceive, and manipulate. Through Bundy, experts identified traits of psychopathy: superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, manipulative tendencies, lack of remorse or empathy, calculated deceit. His interviews helped create the Psychopathy Checklist, PCL, developed by Dr. Robert Hare, a diagnostic tool still used worldwide to assess criminal minds. Ironically, the man who thought himself smarter than everyone else became the very blueprint for identifying people like him. Bundy's cross-country crimes exposed one of the greatest weaknesses in American policing: a lack of communication. Each state had its own jurisdiction, its own database, and its own unsolved cases, all disconnected. When Bundy was finally caught, officials discovered that dozens of police departments had pieces of the puzzle but never shared them. It was a painful revelation. In the years that followed, Congress and law enforcement agencies began developing national data sharing systems, the most notable being the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and the later Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, launched in 1985. These systems allowed detectives across the country to connect patterns of crime in real time, a change that has saved countless lives. Bundy, in death, became the reason killers could no longer slip between the cracks of bureaucracy. Bundy's televised trial in 1979 marked the first time a courtroom became a global stage. Millions watched his every move, his confidence, his arrogance, his manipulative theatrics. It was entertainment to some, but education to others. The public saw how easily charm could disarm judgment, how intelligence could mask evil. That cultural shockwave gave rise to an entirely new genre: true crime. Books like The Stranger Beside Me by and Rule, who had once worked with Bundy at a crisis hotline, brought empathy back to the victims and human insight into the man behind the monster. The story wasn't about glamorizing him, it was about understanding how evil hides. Rule's book became one of the most influential true crime works ever written, shaping responsible storytelling and crime reporting. Through the lens of Bundy, society began to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, gender dynamics, and the dark corners of human psychology. Bundy's pattern of targeting young, independent women ignited a deeper conversation about misogyny and violence in American culture. He preyed on women who were educated, ambitious, and free, women symbolic of the new generation of empowerment emerging in the 1970s. To many feminists, Bundy represented not just a killer, but a metaphor for systemic violence against women, the way society often ignored their fears, dismissed their warnings, and doubted their instincts. After Bundy's arrest, movements grew demanding better protection for women on campuses, improved safety programs, and reforms in how missing persons cases involving women were prioritized. Out of tragedy, a wave of advocacy was born. Women refused to remain silent or afraid. They organized, educated, and empowered one another. Bundy's crimes, though born of hatred and control, inadvertently fueled a revolution of awareness and strength. In the decades following Bundy's execution, his name became shorthand for the hidden predator, the smiling face that conceals malice. Filmmakers, authors, and scholars explored the psychology behind his double life. But over time, a new caution emerged: to study him was not to glorify him. The challenge became finding a balance between understanding evil and avoiding its idolization. Modern documentaries began emphasizing victims' voices, survivors' resilience, and the lessons learned rather than the killer's mystique. Bundy's story evolved from sensational horror into societal study, a reminder that the goal was never fascination but prevention. During Bundy's era, forensic science was still young. Fingerprints, bite marks, and eyewitness accounts were the main evidence. But in the decades after his conviction, science caught up, and DNA profiling emerged as the new weapon against killers who once seemed untouchable. Bundy's case was later revisited by forensic experts who confirmed that modern DNA would have sealed his fate far sooner. This realization pushed the U.S. government to invest heavily in genetic databases, forensic training, and interstate cooperation. Every victim identified through DNA today, every cold case solved after decades, carries a silent echo of what Bundy's case taught the world. Never again should one man's manipulation surpass science and unity. Perhaps the most haunting legacy Bundy left was philosophical. He forced society to confront a terrifying truth, that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can be articulate, polite, successful, even handsome. It can wear a law student's smile or a stranger's helping hand. He changed how people think about trust. Parents taught children to be cautious, colleges implemented self-defense programs, and ordinary citizens learned that intuition, that inner voice of warning, should never be ignored. From fear came wisdom. From deception came awareness. More than 3 decades after his death, Ted Bundy remains a ghost in America's collective memory, not as a celebrity but as a symbol of vigilance. His crimes birthed an era of psychological study, inspired thousands of criminologists, and reinforced the importance of empathy, communication, and education in fighting violence. Bundy's story at its core is not about the monster, it's about the mirror he forced society to face. A mirror that showed both the fragility and the strength of human nature. Ted Bundy's name may never fade from history, but what endures even stronger are the lessons left behind. Evil thrives in silence, awareness destroys it. Charm is not character. And justice, no matter how long delayed, always finds its voice. His story began with deception, but it ends with understanding, because in studying the darkness, the world found new ways to protect the light. The story of Ted Bundy didn't end with his death. It lived on, in courtrooms, classrooms, and quiet living rooms across America. In whispered warnings and in the sharpened instincts of generations who would never again trust too easily. Bundy's name became more than a symbol of terror. It became a caution, a reminder that monsters rarely look like monsters at first glance. But out of that terror rose transformation. His crimes forced the nation to rebuild its systems, redefine its sense of safety, and rethink what it means to understand evil, not to fear it but to outsmart it. When Bundy prowled college campuses in the 1970s, America was still living under a curtain of innocence. Communities trusted strangers. Police departments were local and isolated. The idea that one person could commit dozens of murders, undetected, across multiple states, seemed unthinkable. Bundy shattered that illusion. His crimes awakened the nation to a chilling truth. Evil isn't always born in darkness. Sometimes it grows quietly in plain sight. And that realization changed everything. The way people locked their doors, the way police shared information, and the way psychology sought to explain the unexplainable. He didn't just leave behind bodies. He left behind awareness. The justice system, once reactive, became proactive. Bundy's manipulation of the courts, representing himself, charming reporters, and turning the trial into a spectacle, exposed glaring flaws in the legal process. After his case, states began tightening courtroom protocol, enhancing security, and placing new limits on self-representation to prevent grandstanding. The justice system learned that intelligence without empathy is not brilliance, it's danger. Prosecutors studied Bundy's trial as a masterclass in handling narcissistic defendants, learning how to balance procedure with protection. And beyond the courtroom, the system began to evolve. From evidence preservation to victim support, Bundy's crimes forced America to ask hard questions and demand better answers. Before Bundy, victims often vanished into statistics, their names forgotten in the pursuit of the killer. But after him, everything changed. The faces of Linda Healy, Georgianne Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Kimberly Leach, and so many others became symbols of innocence stolen too soon. Their names were spoken in courtrooms, written in books, and remembered in memorials. For once, the story wasn't only about the killer, it was about those who suffered because of him. The Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, in 1984, and later the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, in 1994, was shaped by a cultural shift that cases like Bundy's helped ignite, laws designed to give survivors and families a voice, a right to justice, and the means to heal. Bundy's cruelty, in the end, birthed compassion. Out of his darkness, empathy found its voice. Before Bundy, evil, was seen as something mystical or inexplicable, a moral failing, not a psychological condition. After Bundy, psychologists began to map its structure. They discovered that people like him weren't monsters by mythology, they were case studies in pathology. Psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial behavior, these became scientific terms, not excuses but explanations. Bundy's interviews became required study for criminal psychologists. He spoke of his compulsions, his rationalizations, his loss of control, yet his words revealed something deeper, a total absence of empathy. He didn't feel remorse. He didn't feel human connection. That absence became a measurable symptom, one that allowed experts to identify future threats before they could strike. His evil, dissected by science, helped humanity defend itself. Bundy's escape from custody, twice, was a national embarrassment, but it also spurred innovation. Law enforcement began modernizing surveillance, tightening prisoner transport procedures, and adopting computerized databases to track fugitives nationwide. He showed them how easy it was to disappear, and in doing so, he made it harder for anyone else to vanish again. The NCIC system expanded, linking every law enforcement agency in America. Fugitive tracking units grew more sophisticated, and with the rise of DNA, no killer could rely on luck and charm to escape forever. Bundy taught investigators that the enemy wasn't just the criminal, it was disorganization. And from that lesson, modern policing was born. Every generation that revisits Bundy's story asks the same question. How could someone so normal-looking, so articulate, be so evil? It's a question that turns the gaze inward. Because Bundy's story isn't just about one man's darkness, it's about our collective need to recognize it before it spreads. He was the reflection of a society too trusting, too naive, too eager to see good where danger hid. But through that reflection came growth. We learned that awareness is not cynicism, it's protection. Bundy changed not only how people view killers but how they view themselves. He forced America to admit that evil can live next door, smile politely and shake your hand, and that recognizing that truth doesn't destroy trust, it strengthens wisdom. The world's fascination with Bundy didn't fade. Documentaries, dramatizations, and interviews kept his story alive, but not without controversy. Some accused the media of glorifying him, turning his face into a brand of horror. Others argued that showing his humanity was essential to understanding the roots of evil. In time, responsible storytelling found its balance. The focus shifted from Bundy's charm to the warning it carried. Filmmakers began centering victims' voices, their dreams, their stolen futures, the real cost of the story. It became less about fear and more about education. Less about the man and more about the message. Bundy wanted to be remembered, and he was, but not in the way he intended. He imagined himself as a brilliant outlaw, a misunderstood genius. History remembers him as a failure, a manipulator whose lies were outlived by truth. His name endures not in admiration, but as a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and crime seminars. Beware the man who wears too many masks. The irony is profound. In trying to prove he was extraordinary, he became the example by which all future monsters are measured and defeated. His legacy is the proof that darkness, when exposed, can illuminate the path to awareness. For all its tragedy, the story of Ted Bundy is also a story of resilience. It's about the detectives who never gave up, the survivors who testified, the families who demanded justice, and the society that refused to forget the lessons. Evil may have a voice, but truth has an echo. And that echo carries farther, across generations, across borders, across time. Bundy showed humanity its worst self, but humanity answered with its best, with science, empathy, vigilance, and reform. In that way, even the darkest life can cast a light of purpose, if only as a warning to protect what is good. Ted Bundy's story is not a tale of monsters. It's a story about people, those who fought to bring him down, those who learned from the aftermath, and those who rebuilt the systems he broke. His crimes shattered innocence, but they also awakened wisdom. They taught law enforcement to unite, psychology to evolve, and society to listen more closely to the voices of the vulnerable. Bundy changed America forever, not through the terror he caused but through the transformation he forced. His evil echoed through time, but in its wake, that echo turned into a chorus of progress. Because in the end, every story of darkness reminds us why the light must never fade.